core group of countries. And the volume looked very much at the Caribbean's relationship with Cuba, its relationship with the French Caribbean, which has been evolving fairly rapidly over the last few years, its relationship with Haiti and the DR, and with its diaspora. Last year, and now we're on the eve of the 50th anniversary of CARICOM, just how the years fly, which is in July, we produce this volume, which we're launching today, Caribbean Integration, Uncertainty in a Time of Global Fragmentation. And this book came into being at a time when the global political economy seemed very fragile. Integration schemes seem to be in crisis, and I mean, the high point of that, or low point if you wish, is the European Union and Britain's exit from the EU. But it wasn't just, it didn't seem to be just a crisis in the EU, but in the whole integration project. And there were lots of fears in CARICOM. Jamaica was making sounds that it wanted to leave CARICOM, and that also was appeared, signal insecurity in the movement. But of course, that whole period also saw the growth of right-wing governments in Europe, in the US, the rise of the Trump administration, and just a general feeling of uncertainty in the world. So that's a broader context. And of course, I can't even say it culminated with the pandemic, but it found new life. That insecurity found new life with the pandemic. So that's the kind of backdrop on which the authors in this volume have reflected on the Caribbean community. And writing on the eve of CARICOM's 50th anniversary provides us with an opportunity to reflect on the aspects of the integration project that remain unfulfilled, those that may no longer be relevant and should be ditched, discarded with, the ways in which CARICOM's agenda has both expanded beyond its initial imaginings, but also areas where it should expand that it may not be considering, and of course, possible directions for the future of the organization. So all these themes are contained within this volume. And because it's a collaborative effort, lots of labor went into this, I want to take the time to acknowledge the contributors in the volume. Ambassador Owen LaRocque, who was the Secretary General at the time of CARICOM's 40th anniversary, and who demitted office around 2 years ago. Tamara Onis, Elaine Moran, and Ronald Cregwell. Ronald Cregwell died before the book was published. Julia Jinku Ramdas, Ronald Gordon, and John Van Sickle. Terry Ann Gilbert Roberts, who was here. Halima Deschang, Natalie Dietrich Jones, Justice Adrian Saunders, who is the president of the Caribbean Court of Justice, April Batiste and Hubert Devonish, Jane Mandel, Cynthia Barrow-Giles, and Vereen Shepherd. And I have a couple chapters there as well. So I want to take the opportunity to thank all of our collaborators, to thank the members of our integration clusters who were not necessarily part of the book, but who are very much part and still are part of that intellectual community that drives us. I want to thank CLACS, of course, for its administrative support, as well as the Watson Communications team. And in terms of the format of the event, I will make brief introductions of our panelists. I would start, and then we'll have the main commentator on the book, who would then engage the co-editors of the book in a conversation around some of the themes and directions. And then we'll open up the discussion for to members of the audience. So it's my pleasure to introduce Colin Constantine, who has generously agreed to wade through this, this very lengthy book and to give comments. And so I'm very grateful, Colin. Thank you so much. Colin Constantine is an assistant professor and official fellow of economics at Girton College, University of Cambridge. He is a member of the Society for the Study of Economic Inequality and is a country expert for Guyana at the Global Dynamics of Social Policy in Germany. His research, teaching, and advising interests are in macroeconomics and political economy. His research integrates income distribution and the balance of payments constraint into macroeconomics to present new insights into the transmission of fiscal and monetary policy in small open economies and the centripetal and centrifugal forces of integration processes. His research also investigates how identity or group-based politics influence governance, the distribution of income and wealth, and economic growth in multi-ethnic societies. Dr. Terry Gilbert Roberts is Research Manager in the Economic Youth and Sustainable Development of the Directorate of the Commonwealth Secretariat, which represents 56 member states. She advocates for evidence-based and inclusive development policy, including strategies for youth, citizen participation in government. She writes about Caribbean regionalism and the politics of development, including her most edited collections on youth participation in the Caribbean, politics and development. She is a Jamaican regionalist, that's how she describes herself, and founding chair of the 50/50 Youth Research Cluster at the University of the West Indies. And finally, we have Professor Jessica Byron, who recently retired as the director of the Institute of International Relations at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus in Trinidad. She was head of the Department of Government, UWI Mona, from 2010 to 2013, and was visiting professorial fellow from 2015 to 2016 at Salises Mona. Before joining UWI, she lectured for some years at the Institute of Social Studies, The Hague, the Netherlands. She also previously served as a Foreign Service Officer with the government of St. Kitts and Nevis and the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, based at the East Caribbean High Commission in London. She has published extensively on Caribbean, Latin American international relations and on small states and territories in the global political economy. Her recent research focuses on Caribbean countries' engagement in South-South cooperation initiatives. Thank you all very much, and I now turn the floor over to Dr. Colin Constantine.
Thank you very much, Pat, for the kind introduction. Just give me 30 seconds to share my screen and put everything up. All right. Harry, can you see my screen, full screen? Just confirm. Yeah?
Yes,
Great, great. All right, Patsy, again, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And the book was long indeed, but it was a fun read, right? I needed this for sure. It was happenstance that you asked me to read and review the book. I needed to refocus again, indeed, on region integration, especially given the fragmentation now indeed in the world economy. All right, so I'm going to spend about half an hour or so. This managed to work. Great. All right, so I'm just going to outline briefly what I think is the key problem and some of the key themes that the book highlights as problems. I'm going to summarize the book's key argument and provide a brief overview of the structure of the book and some of the key points highlighted. And then I'm going to offer some of my own reflections. And of course, I'll present briefly an organizing framework, perhaps to encompass all the key themes and perhaps identify areas of future research, or certainly to guide the conversation here today. And then I'm going to conclude with some open questions for us to explore. All right, so the first key problem is the lack of voice, and lack of voice within countries in terms of a democratic deficit, lack of voice between countries in terms of priorities that are determined by national interest, And there's even weaker voice within regional governance. I need not convince anyone here that the region as a whole has constrained voice in world governance. Now, I want to briefly outline what I call dismal macro facts, because this is the context. This is the material condition of the space and perhaps the rationale for the regional integration. First, low growth, high debt, high unemployment as equilibrium outcomes, meaning this is the normal state of affairs. Falling labor productivity, high income inequality. De facto dollarization. By this, I mean for security purposes, for insurance purposes, we're saving dollars in deposit accounts, whether within the jurisdiction of the region or outside of the region. We may try to engage in borrowing at lower costs, and we prefer dollar loans rather than local currency loans. And there may be partial currency substitution. By that, I mean, if you go to Barbados, for example, if in Jamaica, you can purchase goods and services in dollars, for example. Yeah, this is the normal state of affairs in the region. Repeated balance of payments crises, high cost of finance, part of the standard complaint in the region, and of course, the brain drain story. There's a rapid exit, what I call exit via extra-regional integration, and that of course refers to the human capital flight that we observe for centuries within the space. So there's foot voting in North America and Europe primarily. In terms of, are we for production structure integration in terms of the model, or is it standard market extension, market integration in terms of the CSME style? Now, Jay Mandel framed what I think is one problem in the following way. He highlighted the political indifference to the regional project, and I think he's spot on. I'm not criticizing this framing. I do think there is significant political indifference. This is a major problem we need to grapple with and explain. Now, these are things to explain. All right. The argument as it relates to voice is that we need more voice, obviously, more democracy in regional governance. We need to cultivate some kind of regional constituency, and this may lead to regional politics and perhaps some kind of political integration, federation style, or some other mode. Carbon integration itself, then we need to reduce the bureaucratic inertia. This was the big complaint in the Golden Report. CSME plus is one of the arguments. What does that mean? Well, Patsy Lewis, of course, insists on production transformation, for example, some kind of production integration, but we should also integrate beyond the realm of material things, meaning we should build on our shared history, or shared values, shared language, shared culture, etc. And that too needs to be part of the Caribbean integration project. There are new opportunities for regional solidarity. The climate justice certainly means the business cycles between these countries and with the rest of the world will differ, and this has significant implications for whether or not we can share a common currency, whether or not we can have a common fiscal approach, etc. And the big issue, what I think is the big issue, of course, is there's a parallel integration process that is ongoing, independent of public policy, and that is the human capital flight. People are already integrating with Western Europe and North America. Limited formal structures for civil society and private sector participation, the lack of democracy fundamentally. Again, a key point that needs to be explained. Now, I think this gets to the point of my thesis, and I'm going to quote LaRocque here very briefly. The true test of the CSME is if it has helped in solving the economic problems of the member state. So CSME, or the Caribbean Integration Project, has to be a solution to a problem or several problems, and it should be pitched and understood in those terms. He goes further. We probably have adopted a too theoretical model of integration. Now, I would frame this differently. I would say perhaps we've adopted the wrong model of integration, but I leave that as an open question for now for us to discuss at the end. Limits to economic integration. So there is a chapter or two on the standard conditions derived from optimal currency area theory that will determine whether or not two or more countries can share a common currency or have some kind of common macro policy to growth and development. The short answer is, well, key countries in the region have divergent growth and business. Yeah, meaning it's going to be very difficult to have a common monetary policy. The same is true in the Eurozone area, by the way. So the European Union, for example, when they were targeting inflation, they were really targeting Germany's inflation. So this led to stagnation in the northern part of Europe and significant inflationary booms in the southern part of Europe. And this is exactly what we find in this particular chapter. In terms of wider macro convergence beyond business cycles, well, there's weak evidence of fiscal convergence according to this paper. And if we were to consult the wider literature, we find weak evidence for other macro indicators as well, in terms of inflation, growth, etc. Patsy again calls for a step beyond the CSME. Production integration, what are the details therein? What are the experiences elsewhere? What does it mean for theory of integration? I think big opportunity for scholars. Bringing the people in, fundamental, given the historical experience in the region. So there's a major democratic deficit. And Terrian argues that democratization has never been part of the agenda of CARICOM. It's not a top priority at all. This must be explained. What's with the elite-centric approach to regional government? Is that a problem? Or how do we better understand that problem? Now, of course, this means there will be limited participation for the rank and file, particularly the young people in the region. Labor mobility issues. Well, given the politics over the past decade, I think it was there about Barbados and Guyana in terms of migration disputes, there is significant room for convergence between national and regional approaches as it relates to labor mobility. But Natalie is a careful scholar. She notes the following. This is not to suggest a blanket commitment to freedom of movement, irrespective of internal and external constraints. I read this and I love this framing. We must be concrete, we must be careful and nuanced when making recommendations, particularly about regional integration, given that there are major trade-offs between countries, but within countries. Yeah? And we need to be cognizant of those particular trade-offs. Right. Now, there are some victories. Yeah, there are regional advocates that can produce national victories, and I like this chapter. I'm not an expert, of course, in domestic violence, etc., but this was a learning chapter for me. So there's a regional legislation on domestic violence that actually is really good. Apparently, it can set the stage for what other countries can adopt. Some countries have taken positive steps in adopting that perfect model. Other countries are yet to make steps on. But the point here is that actually we could have national changes with regional advocates rather than national advocates leading to regional changes. And I imagine this is something perhaps we would need to build on. I'm looking forward to discussions on this dichotomy as it relates to advocacy at the national level and advocacy at the regional level. There are emerging priorities, climate change. This was a good chapter, a very short chapter, but it was a fun read by Jay Mandel. I think, if I remember correctly, I think he's in the audience. He argues that climate change is the big threat of our time. Is the big threat not because perhaps some of these islands are sinking, but it will undermine the tourism product. If beaches are going under, then what is the tourism product? We just have the sand in the sea, but the beach is no longer there. So we have to think hard, and he argues that we need a common technological leap, or of course, innovation, scientific progress, and advancement would be at the forefront. I think that's a tall order. I have some suggestions. I'm going to save that until the end of what the climate change threat may mean. But of course, I think he is absolutely right. This is an existential threat, not just in terms of survivability, but in terms of the economy in these spaces. This, I can't recall the author, and I have to forgive me, but there's a chapter or two on political reforms. The point was small states may create a major problem for campaign financing. You could have one oligarch or a handful of wealthy individuals in St. Kitts, let's say, that can easily buy elections. This is a major problem. This is a common problem, and perhaps we can build on this common interest. The chapter did not get into the specific point of how we build on the common interest, but I want to emphasize that certainly that's what this should mean. Reparatory justice. Of course, there's a big movement now on reparations, and there's a 10-point plan in this particular chapter, but I want to emphasize 3 points about reparations. Reparations can mean and should mean technology transfer. This perhaps can be connected with Diamando's point about scientific advance. After World War II, there's a so-called Marshall Plan. Part of the Marshall Plan was not just reconstruction of Europe. It was genuine technology transfer. American entrepreneurs, American enterprise came to Europe, Western Europe, of course. This is Cold War era. Came to Western Europe, shared latest technology, the latest business practice, and that is genuine technology transfer. And we should envision reparations in those terms. Education, well, this is a no-brainer, of course, and that's easy to do. There are different models that we can explore with. Debt cancellation, Of course, that should be part of the story, but we should go bigger than that. What's the causal mechanism that lead to debt crises? And reparations should be solving the root cause of the repeat of debt crises. All right. I think we need a tighter mapping of the problems we highlighted about CARICOM, for example, the bureaucratic inertia or the implementation deficit, or the elite-centric governance approach, or Mandel's point about political indifference. These are real issues, but we need to tie these issues, in my view, to nation-states problems, either political issues or what I call dismal macro facts. I think when we discuss regional integration going forward, what I would like to see, a clear theoretical case of how integration deals with the dismal macro facts. If regional integration is not resolving the dismal macro facts, what is the purpose of CARICOM? This is how we build a constituency beyond the political elite. If we have a problem with high debt, high unemployment, high inequality, tell me how carbon integration, whatever your model, solves that problem. And that's just one problem. We have repeat debt crises. We have de facto dollarization. How does carbon integration, as you envision it, solve that problem? If we do not have concrete answers to these problems, what is the purpose of carbon integration? And of course, that does not mean that there isn't a point about shared history, shared values. Obviously, that is fundamental, and that will keep us in times of distress. But we must meet people's material conditions. It is our failure to meet people's material conditions is why we have a parallel integration process with North America and the Western Europe. Optimal currency area is a theory developed by Robert Mundell at Columbia. I can't recall the specific year when he wrote the article. But the article was, the political context is to present an economic rationale, an economic justification for why we should strengthen or deepen the integration process in Europe. So the political goal really was to ensure that we never have a repeat of a German-led World War I or World War II. Yeah, so the political context was clear, and that was the rationale for this particular theory. I would like to see, when we think about estimating convergence criteria in the Caribbean or less developed countries, we move beyond the optimal currency area conditions, even the European countries. And I have an appendix. I'm not going to talk about the appendix, but you're welcome to have a look at the appendix where I present some evidence in the Eurozone area. Even the European countries have not met the optimal currency area theory, right? And it's a theory conditioned on market extension, not state production transformation, Patsy Lewis vision, for example. Now, there's lots to debate about or complain about as it relates to the political limitations of CARICOM, but any political economy analysis of CARICOM, I would argue, needs to be embedded in political economy analysis of nation states, right? We must understand that political elites, however limited they may be or inadequate in our view, have political constraints that are local. That's the context in which they operate. All right. I love the title of this book. I'm obsessed with titles. Uncertainty in Time of Global Fragmentation. You know, I'm jealous. I wish I had thought of something like, I may very well write a paper with that title. But with that title, we certainly have to answer the question, how to reduce uncertainty. All right? I'm going to argue that we need new theories beyond market extension, beyond OCA, and we need to explore alternative models to reduce dismal macro facts. We shouldn't be coming up with alternative models of integration for the sake of integration. And it's not just based on shared history, etc. We need to respond to the problematics of the nation states. Production integration, of course, is one alternative model, but we still need a lot more details on that, and certainly many more alternatives, right? And we must remember that we tried this in the past, actually. Norman Griffin has some interesting articles about attempts between Trinidad and Jamaica trying to combine, cheap energy, oil, bauxite, etc., and the fact that they could not agree on how they're going to share the value added. So that's what I mean by devising a sustainable and just distributed formula. So think of global value chains. Global value chains presently, the distribution is determined by market forces. Is that going to be the approach? If it is, I submit to you, then we're back to square one. Some countries are in an advantageous position than others because of geography, because of natural endowments, etc. So theory about production integration needs to be clear about how we're going to divide the spoils. They must be just and they must be sustainable. We're going to need new theories, new political economy theories of integration to reduce the democratic deficits. We can't take these things for granted. We can't complain that local politics is undemocratic and therefore regional politics is the same. So this is an opportunity, in my view, for scholarship, exciting scholarship. None of this is useful without evidence. Evidence of what? Whatever your proposal about Caribbean integration, we need to be clear about what are the distributional gains and losses within a country, first of all. Who are going to be the winners and losers in Jamaica? First of all, we need to answer that question. Then we need to be clear about what are distributional gains and losses between Jamaica and Guyana, for example. That's the world. Politics is always about distribution. Yeah? The distribution of political power between political elites. And in the context we're discussing here, distribution of resources or gains and losses between countries. So, in my view, we still need to make the case for deep integration. We need to be clear about what the model is. And if you read this book, and I recommend you read the book, well, there's a debate about whether or not we're following the right model. That was the point of Lerouk's quote. Perhaps we're too theoretical in his view, or maybe the theoretical model is flawed. Yeah? And then we're not clear about the gains in terms of evidence. We can't make claims. We need to present evidence. This is how we're going to produce a constituency or develop buy-in, so to speak. All right, so I'm briefly going to present an organizing framework just to provoke some thinking. This is a community of scholars here, so perhaps future research can delve into some of the things that I'm going to highlight. And all of this is just speculation here. Hopefully I don't embarrass myself with this speculation. All right, so we have the well-known integration trilemma. If you Google this, this will pop up. It's the idea that, we can choose national sovereignty and electoral democracy, and therefore we're isolated. We're not integrated in the world economy, or we're not integrated within Europe, or say within the Caribbean. Or we can choose to do away with national sovereignty, but we want to remain democratic, all right? And we want to integrate perhaps with the world or with the rest of CARICOM or the EU. And therefore, politics is about regional politics. So this is some kind of political union, some kind of federation. Or we can choose to ignore electoral democracy. We want to have some kind of integrated relationship with our neighbors, but we want to maintain national sovereignty, fiscal, monetary, political, whatever. And then, of course, this is the whole idea about implementation deficits. Well, sometimes, whatever the regional policy is, it may conflict with your national interest, thus implementation deficits. Of course, there aren't any voters here, there aren't any organs or opportunities to participate if you civil society or the private sector, thus the democratic deficit. And indeed, this is where we are in the region. And integration processes in the rest of the world, South America, Africa, etc. What I mean by a tighter mapping between the problems of CARICOM and nation states is that integration trilemma is really underpinned by other trilemmas. Yeah? For example, there is what I'm going to call an electoral democracy trilemma, a growth regime and BOP trilemma that may explain what we observe in the region. And then there's the standard monetary policy trilemma and finance trilemma. So what I'm going to do now is briefly explain what some of these things mean, and some of them may not indeed be trilemmas, they may be dilemmas, really. And you'll see what I mean in a minute. So, for example, we have an electoral democracy trilemma. And what I mean by that is the following. Well, we have a choice to remain democratic in terms of elections, and I choose the term electoral democracy rather than liberal democracy deliberately. Yeah? So electoral democracy and high inequality. What does that mean? Well, that means we live in a world of economic polarization. Everything is elite-centric, money buys politics. Indeed, this is the world we live in now. But we could choose to live in a world with low inequality. And that will lead us to what I call identity voting and electoral politics. In a world of low inequality, it means social mobility is going to be higher. Any country with low inequality is going to be an attractive country to potential migrants. And thus, this leads to inflows of labor and the rise of xenophobia. The time horizon might be very long for this to take effect, perhaps 3 decades, but these effects do bite, and this can lead to political polarization or identity-centric politics. In either regime, whether we live in a world of low inequality and electoral democracy or high inequality and electoral democracy, local politics is elite-centric. And this may explain why the integration process in the region is dominated by elites, why it's non-democratic, essentially, because that's a reflection of what's happening in nation states. The growth regime paradigm, we are forced to be export-led in the region. And that requires us to think about cost competitiveness, particularly wage competitiveness in the export sector. This is one reason why we're forced to live in a regime of high inequality and export growth. We could choose low inequality, but because we're confined to a world of export growth, the price for low inequality is high unemployment. And this will lead, of course, to domestic demand stagnation. High inequality, high unemployment is not a real choice. So I'm not going to say anything on that. And high unemployment as a political choice is untenable. So we are doomed, in a sense, to live in a regime of high inequality and export-led growth. This might be the economic context for why politics is elite-centric. All right, the balance of payments trilemma. We cannot discuss the Caribbean without discussing balance of payments. Every 10 years, we have a balance of payments problem. Every 10 years, we have to go to the island. Every 10 years, we have to undertake fiscal adjustments. So the balance of payments is very much part of our story. So the choices may be high unemployment and complete dollarization, or high unemployment and balance of payment sustainability. Of course, if we're going to choose that, and we are confined in the long run to have sustainable balance of payments, this requires domestic demand stagnation, which means we're doomed, in a sense, to high unemployment. Or we could choose to have low unemployment and maintain balance of payment sustainability, but this requires us to have complete dollarization. And if we do that, we reduce unemployment with international migration, which is the current scenario in a sense. The problem is international migration cannot continue without limit. There are political constraints. So this is not a long-run outcome. And if we were to engage in complete dollarization, for reasons I don't want to get into now, they tend to produce balance of payments crises. Dollarization will lead to massive capital outflow, etc., all manner of balance of payments issues. So we have a forced choice in the region of balance of payment sustainability and high unemployment. And this may be forcing us to be an export-led growth regime with high inequality. The big point is, obviously, when we think about Caribbean integration, whatever model you have in mind, whatever the ambition is, how are we going to address these issues? The monetary policy trilemma, I'm not going to say anything on here because this is standard. If you do any introductory economics, open economy, macro, well, there's a choice, right? If you have a fixed exchange rate and you have free capital mobility, you can't have independent monetary policy. Yeah? We live in a world where we're kind of forced to, because of global politics, to have free capital mobility. It matters not. There are significant limits to national sovereignty. All right, this is my last slide on the organizing framework. This is what I call the finance trilemma. High cost of finance is a big complaint in the region, and we can fix that problem very easily. We can choose to borrow in dollars, which we do in Jamaica, for example, and other parts of the Caribbean. The problem is, with de facto dollarization, when we borrow in dollars, they tend to produce debt crises, because, of course, we have to repay in dollars. Yeah, so there's an exchange rate risk, or there's a balance of payment issue here with de facto dollarization. So we prefer not to have debt crises. So in a sense, we're kind of doomed again of high cost of domestic finance with free capital mobility. These are the problems of nation states in the Caribbean and indeed South America and Africa, etc. When we think of integration among developing economies, we need to put these problems at the center of that project. At least this is my view. We can discuss that further at the end. So there are several what I think are open questions from the book. First, I want to start with the people because I think it's very important. Is there a minimum efficient scale for effective democracy? Could we have an effective democracy, liberal democracy, with a population of 200,000 people? Right? If there is a minimum efficient scale, then of course this is a strong justification for political integration. Forget the dismal macro facts for a minute. If we want to live in a good society, right? Maybe we need a critical number of people. Right. In Guyana, for example, of course, in Guyanese, I know a lot about Guyana. Separation of powers, checks and balances, independent judiciaries, these things don't mean anything because the truth is, it's such a small country, it's difficult to be independent. I imagine this problem would be worse if a population of 30,000 people. How do we democratize or establish regional politics when nation-state politics is client-based? That's our constraint. That's our status quo. Right? The status quo is not Western European style politics or American politics, where you have a middle class and you could have some kind of interest-based political dialogue. In our part of the world, it's client-based. What is the new social contract? And how do we incentivize the new social contract for deeper integration? In other words, why would national elites in the Caribbean choose to concede power to a regional authority? Why should it? What's the bargain for them? What's in it for the elite? We need to be clear about that. Then we need to figure out how we're going to incentivize them to take this bargain. Now, in the European case, I imagine one might want to think that, well, we need to look at why that happened. But I was clear earlier about OCA theory. The political project was clear for Europe as it relates to time in Germany, right? But you must remember context. Post-World War II, we are in a world of Keynesian orthodoxy. We are in a world of Cold War politics. Taxation on top incomes were really high. We know this from Piketty. We know that inequality is at historical lows. This is a time of success of the working class. So economic integration was a great opportunity to undermine unions in Europe. So that's what the political elites get in return for integration. They get to reduce wages and increase inequality. They get to reduce taxes. They get to complain about cost competitiveness and X, Y, and Z will serve cost competitiveness. That's the bargain for Europe. That's certain. That shouldn't be how we pitch Caribbean integration. Obviously, not where the context is one of high inequality already. I think I've mentioned the ongoing or the parallel integration process. Citizens of the region have decided already for themselves to vote with their feet. That's ongoing. That's independent of scholarship. That's independent of advocacy. How do we reconcile that reality, an ongoing reality, with our ambition here today? All right. What model of Caribbean integration? Well, this is the big question of the day. Yeah. I don't expect any of the panelists necessarily to present concrete answers to this, but I would be happy, of course, to hear their thoughts. Which goals of the CSNE are worth pursuing? And this perhaps is a question to Patsy Lewis because of, she's insisting we must go beyond the CSNE. Are there new goals to be pursued? What are those? Now, I don't recall the book having a chapter on transportation. In Europe, one impetus for integration, of course, is you can drive from France to Germany. We could produce goods and services, transport goods and services, at really low cost. This is a major advantage of being land-based. Air travel is still very expensive. Forget about tourism or leisure travel in terms of transporting commercial goods and services. Air travel is a major impediment. It need not be the end of the world. It need not be the end of the world. We would have to think creatively how we would, make lemonade with that lemon. Guyana is oil rich. It's history part 2 because Trinidad has been oil rich. All the opportunities that Guyana presents, we had those opportunities with oil rich Trinidad. Do we explore a new reserve pool again? A regional clearance system again? I say again because we tried and it collapsed. So what are the lessons from that experience? Is that a non-starter? Would Guyana present the last hurrah at some version of production integration? Or will they be, renewed national private sector confrontation? And I would submit to you that's happening already between Guyana private sector and Trinidad's private sector, for example. So it's history part two. All right, I recommend the book. Right, it was a great read. It was an easy read. Read most of it in bed, so it's one of those books you can certainly read at night. I hope that's an incentive to read the book. I think it's timely indeed. It's the 50th anniversary of CARICOM. It's a time to rethink. All right, the world is fragmenting again in scary ways. Perhaps we're going to need another book, Patsy, on the global fragmentation and what that means for the Caribbean's positioning, China, United States, or a new non-alignment movement. So the book is you can't get more current than a book like this. For me personally, it was inspiring. I'm filled with new energy again to think harder on Caribbean integration, to be as concrete as one can as it relates to how we reduce some of those dismal macro facts in an integrated fashion. And in the appendix, as I said, there are a few slides on the Eurozone. If you're interested, and the Eurozone is, just to show you the title, the Eurozone is a story of divergence. So if the European model is our inspiration, I want to be clear, that model is a model of divergence, not convergence. Thus the Eurozone crisis. All right? So I'm going to end here, and I'm happy to take questions. And of course, I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Actually, I'm not clear where I should be properly positioned in this thing. Oh, okay. So maybe I'll just stay here and take my computer. Colin, thank you so very much for this, really amazing review. And I am not an economist. I was never trained as an economist, and I've always felt that I have been taking on issues that somebody needs to take on, and most people seem not to take them on in the same way that I think it should be taken on. So I'm really glad to have a frontally economic perspective on integration. And I have to say, Colin, that I'm very happy that you have found new enthusiasm for reading this book, because I am ready to hand the baton over to you. Okay, I think at this stage in my life, I've probably had enough, but I know that these questions are so fundamental that they will continue. They'll continue to be with us for a very long time. So, how do you want us to proceed? Are there specific questions you want to ask us?
Well, I could perhaps share my screen again and pull up the
Sure.
questions, or we can start
Sure.
there, I think. They could figure out how to share. Right, perhaps we should start with you, Patsy.
Sure.
Which goals of the CSME, in your view, are worth pursuing now?
I think they are worth or not worth pursuing.
So worth pursuing. We're positive here.
Oh, let's talk about not worth pursuing. Ditch the notion of a common currency. Let me say it differently. To me, the shift to the CSME has shifted us away, and I think I may disagree with you a bit on what I see as CARICOM's fundamental role. Of course, the importance of a regional organization to making a difference to regional economies and people's lives and livelihoods is crucial, it's very important. But I think in this focus on the economics and the mechanics of the economics, frankly, I think we have been following the wrong model. I think the model based on free trade, when we don't even produce properly, is not it's a non-starter as a model. And CSME focuses very much on trade. It makes a little bit of lip service to production integration. And we can come to production integration because it's by no means clear that, there are lots of possibilities for that. And we have to think about how we think about production integration and what that might look like, what we can rescue from that. But what is clear to me is that trade should be the least important of everything we do in CARICOM. And I think that one of the things that we ignore about CARICOM is its potential to do more. Its potential to uplift people, to remember where we're coming from as societies that were founded in slavery and forced labor, that were launched into a world that was deliberately set up in a way that we are located in a particular structural relationship that did not necessarily mean that it was a route to real freedom and liberation for people. So I think if we think about regional integration in a different kind of space as to what should this type of arrangement do for people's self-esteem, of course for their economic well-being, but for their sense of belonging. And I think, and maybe I'm going beyond the question you're asking, but in terms of what I see as one of the things, the focus that CARICOM can take, that it hasn't really been taking much. And I know I'm talking about CARICOM, but I know CARICOM is at the mercy of its heads of state, okay? But it's not just to say Ghana has oil and what's going to happen. Are we going to have a reserve of a kind of regional reserve where we lend, like Trinidad had oil reserves, where it lent other Caribbean countries money. But the question is, how do we see CARICOM as having a role in first identifying resources like oil, in deciding on the regulatory framework for exploiting those resources, answering the question about whether we should even exploit those resources, and then how do people benefit from those resources? And oil is just obvious, and oil exploration and it's not going to stop at Ghana because there's oil all over the Caribbean. So that's going to become an increasing question. But the question is, what is CARICOM's regulatory function? How should CARICOM provide a space for sectors like the tourism industry? Yes, to address issues of climate change, but what about addressing how people belong in a model that excludes people increasingly from their birthright? What should be their birthright? Access to resources, access to the beach, access to what people think of as a good life, clean water, unpolluted beaches. So I think that I would like to broaden the ways in which we think of CARICOM and its function beyond the CSME. And I've spoken too long, so I would stop and...
Just a quick response, and then I think we should hear from Jessica. I completely agree. It's fair to say that the ambition of CARICOM should not be to resolve dismal macro fact. I think that's fair. It may not be possible to link the two, but then we need to be clear about that to the constituency. And I guess that my response would be then there is major mixed messaging about the purpose of CARICOM. All right, Jessica? No, you're muted. You're muted, Jessica. You're muted.
Me now?
Yeah, we hear you now.
Okay, yeah. I had on earphones because there's a lawnmower outside going full blast. I hope it does not make a disturbance. Yeah, I wanted to say that I think some of the CSME goals are de facto ditched anyway, and it would make sense to stop pretending that eventually there is going to be a common currency at the CARICOM level, because it's just not going to happen. But apart from that, it is worth making the observation that a common currency in the East Caribbean Central Bank area, the ECCU, that has worked very well. And that has certainly, at the sub-regional level of integration, that has been a definite plus. When we talk about the CSME, well, you've been focusing very much on production integration. And when we say production integration, we seem to be talking about merchandise exchanges. But production integration, I would think, also refers to trade and services. And those are areas that CARICOM has relatively neglected. And they are areas which are increasingly important because many of our economies are 90% based on on production and trade and services. And there are, in fact, there is a lot of service exchange throughout the region that is not properly measured, not documented, and not enough has been done to free up and to liberalize those service exchanges, including in areas that offer a lot of new opportunities to the average Caribbean citizen, such as the creative economy. No, the other thing is that there are institutions within the CSME that have brought value added to a lot of us. The ability to move and work. Now, there are abuses. Many countries have fallen short of their obligations, but it is worth noting that a lot of Caribbean people have been able to move and work across the Caribbean and to eventually settle and open businesses in other CARICOM countries. That is a part of CSME. There is also the agreement on social security. Its workings are bureaucratic, but it does mean that many CARICOM citizens are able to gain access to the social security payments that they have made, even though they have worked across 3 or 4 CARICOM countries. So I don't think we should be ditching things like that. I think these are important gains that have been made during CARICOM's last 30 years. Concerning air travel, why are we fixated only on air travel? CARICOM has lamentably neglected proper pursuit of freeing up travel across the region. But I mean, we're a marine area. Why haven't we done more to promote sea travel as well? And now there is more of a focus on maritime travel across the region. It makes a lot of sense in some parts of the Caribbean. And I have been noting quite a lot more investment in ferries between different parts of CARICOM lately. And obviously, it's not one or the other, but there are options beyond air travel that ought to be pursued much more than they are. And the ferry options, I think, would do more to promote people-to-people integration. From what I've been observing amongst the Leeward and Windward Islands in the last few years. So those are just 2 things I wanted to.
Those are great points. But I completely agree on the marine or sea travel. I suppose some of the issues might be the time consideration, but that need not be a major constraint. I completely agree.
Not if you have islands that are 30 miles apart.
Surely. Carrie Ann, just to bring you in, I wonder if you wanted to comment on what new goals perhaps are worth pursuing.
Well, can I just comment on
Sure.
the issue of the CSME before I go to new goals,
Sure.
Colin? Because I think the two are related. I wanted to say first that in many ways, yeah, for me, the CSME is like a dream deferred in a sense. It's almost as if I had accepted. I came into integration, I fell in love with integration in the sense of being Caribbean as a young person. And at that time, there was a big push for young people to advocate for the CSME and to tell all of our peers about this wonderful experience that we would then be able to benefit from. And that has not yet happened. And so there's a little bit of a loss there. And I think that's because the CSME is essentially a project of the member states. And you spoke about what Erwin LaRocque was reflecting on at the 40th anniversary, where he said the true test of the CSME is solving the economic problems of member states. And that is true, because that was what the project was. But for Caribbean people, no, the true test of the CSME or the true test of integration is whether it solves our development challenges. So it's about shifting the narrative away from just what member states want. And I recognize the challenge of me saying this about an intergovernmental institution, but shifting the narrative away from what just the member states want to what the nationals want, and how, in a sense, the CSME as a project has failed, and hence the idea of moving towards CSME plus. I want to recognize, though, some progress made by member states. The recent decision to have this, to go back to the idea of a variable geometry in integration and to adopt this new protocol on enhanced, I believe it's called enhanced cooperation, in the sense that those member states that are ready to move ahead on some of the goals of the CSME can do so without the others. And I think that's very pragmatic, and that's perhaps what is needed. The new goals now, Colin, to move away. If we shift the narrative away from what is just a project, the CSME as a project of member states, to regional integration as an aspiration for Caribbean people or for Caribbean nationals, then the goals have to shift a little bit. And maybe later I'll come back to some of the other questions you asked about, is there a minimum scale for a liberal democracy? How do we democratize the systems? And here I think that the new goals have to be about how the regional system reinforces rights of Caribbean people. I think that is what comes through very much in that section of the book on bringing people in. Those excellent chapters, and I just want to thank our contributors in that section, Halima, Natalie Dietrich-Jones, Adrian Saunders, April Baptiste, and Hubert Devonish. They bring to the center this goal of using the regional framework as a way to reinforce and encourage member states to respect and reinforce the rights of young people, and to identify what are the responsibilities of a CARICOM citizen. Not a Jamaican or a St. Lucian or a Grenadian or a Tahitian national who lives in CARICOM, but the regionally bestowed rights which are meant to be reaped and enjoyed at a national level. And I think that is really the new goal about those issues around solidarity. The minimum scale for democratic representation has to be a scale that allows for the interests of the most vulnerable and the excluded to be taken into consideration. So how do we use the regional system to hear from people at the most local levels? And I think the paper from Halima Deschamps and the paper from April Baptiste and Hubert Devonish allow us to look at that, how either at very local levels, people's voices can be heard and influence the trajectory of regional development, or the regional solidarity of a movement around domestic violence can be used to bring to bear on national decision-making, the decision to adopt regional legislation. So I just wanted to raise that here at this point, just to say then that it has to be about how we allow the voices of ordinary nationals to influence how we conceive of integration beyond the CSME and how we then act on it. And maybe as we pursue the other questions, I'll come back to the point, some of the other points on democratization.
Just a quick comment. I mean, the region is not just to protect regional rights, but I would say national rights. Think of March 2020 in Guyana, for example. Yeah, I mean, that's a non-trivial contribution, certainly, of the regional project. Jessica, you have your hand up, or was that the...
Yes, I had my hand up. Can you hear me now?
Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I had my hand up to just endorse and add a little bit to Terry's comments. I think that the CCJ has been a definite advance in terms of the protection of national rights because of the role it has played in helping to lift the standard of the efficiency of the courts across the member countries. And, you know, there are countries where people get lost, people are arrested, and they're on remand. Their cases are never heard, and they can be lost in jail for 7-8 years because of an inefficient legal system. And I believe that the CCJ's constant attention to justice delayed is justice denied has done a lot to increase the efficiency of our national and regional court system and to reduce the abuse, the terrible abuse of the legal rights of ordinary citizens who have suffered this in the past in many of our countries.
Can I jump in?
Go ahead.
I want to come to your question of, you mentioned elites and how are we going to have incentives for new social contracts for deeper integration. And touching back to Jessica's comments about movement within the CSME and the ways in which that has really had an effect on people's lives. My own issue with freedom of movement is that it underscores the elitist nature of CARICOM in that, and also the neoliberal framing of the project, in that what value do you bring to the economy that gives you the right to move and live in another Caribbean country? You have to be well connected, you have to have the right education, you have to fit in this economic model. And it has no place for the high numbers of unemployed youth. There is no space in that regional model for them to improve their situations, to find jobs somewhere else that they may not be able to find at home, to find dignity as human beings. Because when you have a project that says only these people can move, then how are the other people supposed to feel? How is this project addressing them and their sense of dignity and their sense of worth? So I think even as we think it's a move in the right direction, it's a move that underscores the inherently elitist model. And that comes to your question, how do you decenter elites in the CARICOM project? Because it's an elite project. It's elite intellectually, not just in terms of how the economy is conceived, but in terms of the ideas, where the ideas are drawn, the people that are brought to the forefront of this movement in terms of thinking it through. How do you decenter that? Those elites are not going to give up. They're not going to give up just like that. And I think that there has to be a lot of pushback at the grassroots level. But it's interesting because nobody in Grenada or St. Kitts has CARICOM at the forefront of their mind when they think about their social justice or their liberties. So they think about it nationally. What does it mean to be unemployed in Grenada, to be marginalized from economic and political and social life in many ways. And how do you get around that? So I think it's very difficult. It's kind of artificial to separate when you think about democratization, when you think about decentering elites. It's hard to see this as something that happens on a regional level, but not as something that is really foundational to each of these countries. And I think it has to be a movement to democratize these national spaces to the extent to which we can call them national, and for that also to shape the regional project. If the regional project and its architects are forward thinking, then they could try to kickstart that process, or at least even have a parallel process by trying to get more grassroots input into conceptualizing CARICOM and its role. And I liked how Terry-Ann put it, that what's the minimum unit for what you consider democratic, the extent to which it captures the voices of the most marginal people. And I think that's a really, meaningful way of thinking about it, not in terms of numbers. So, I think there's a lot that we have to chew on, and I'll shut up for the moment.
Terry-Ann?
Thanks a lot, Colin, and thanks, Patsy. I wholeheartedly agree, I think, on this issue of, and I think, Colin, you had said we have to make that tighter link or tie closer this issue of the regional problems with national issues. And I think that is what Patsy is saying about, there is a crisis of democracy, globally, nationally, regionally, locally. What does democracy mean to us anymore? And it's the question of who is allowed, who is considered in a democracy, whose rights are respected, and who's allowed to be a part of the process. But more so, I think also how. So in my chapter in the book, I speak a lot about how I think CARICOM has progressed towards this idea of citizenization through its CARICOM Youth Ambassadors program and involving those elites in the formal existing institutional processes for deliberative governance and so on, which is good. And I speak about how that has changed my own trajectory, how it has changed other people. But I think about all those other young people, as Patsy said, the many unemployed young people. The many young people are not a part of perhaps elite political youth wings or national youth councils and so on. And I think about how they may even express their ideas about integration and what it means, or the sense of Caribbean identity, if such a thing exists, or a sense of aspiration of what they want. How would they express it? And some may express it not in the way that it can fit within the short statements that you make at a COSOD, at the Council for Human and Social Development, or a CARICOM Heads of Government meeting. And are there other ways that young people, CARICOM and CARICOM's institutions can hear from people in their own language? And I'm here speaking about linguistics in the sense of the many languages that people speak, oral languages in the commons, but also languages of art. And it just reminds me of the fact that, our cover for this book that you see on the poster was actually, I don't know if you can see it well on my screen, but this boat that you see that's on the shore here, this is an original piece of artwork that was created by Stephanie Thomas, who was a former CARICOM Youth Ambassador. And that speaks to the sense that now, as an older professional, how much the sense of Caribbeanness has imprinted on her, that she heard about this volume. We had a conversation about this volume and what it speaks to. And she felt so inspired that she created this piece of artwork to reflect what this was all about. And if I just sort of speak very briefly to what she said in her statement about this piece, she said that this book, this fishing boat that's on this cover, is a relatable element of the Caribbean experience, perhaps run aground, unanchored, but still functional and beautiful at its core. CARICOM has the potential to be righted, especially if we pay attention to new areas. And she speaks about some of the things we discuss in the book: youth participation, climate, gender, reparations. The point I'm making here is that even young people or others who express themselves in a very in alternative ways, where is the space for them in decision making, in trying to shape the direction of regional integration? How are their voices captured? CARICOM has done it through regional visions of young people that have been developed and updated and compiled over the years. But where are even some of the artistic expressions that I think need to be brought to bear to help us understand of what integration should mean to people? And I just wanted to mention that quickly.
No, I completely agree and appreciate the commentary. Of course, this indicates that there's a major crisis of political leadership. I don't mean elected officials now, because once upon a time, political mobilization used to be regional. Once upon a time, union activity and membership used to be regional, right? And I'm talking, of course, in the 30s, 40s, and going up to the independence era, right? Young radicals, and I use radicals in a positive sense here, right? So there is a major crisis of political leadership in that regard. I do want to go back to the CCJ point, though, and I agree with everything Jessica said, and of course, March 2020 in Diana demonstrates that, I think, powerfully. But you must remember that membership of CCJ is also very limited, right? Not all countries have signed up, and this too is a problem. I could give you lots of political economy justifications in Guyana's case why CCJ is in their interest, like, as an arbiter, given that ethnic rivalry in that specific country, right? So there are major gains, of course, in on this front, for example, but it hasn't gotten major buy-in, of course, in the wider Caribbean, and this, of course, is disappointing to say the least. All right, Patsy, do you want to comment? You want to go back on any point?
No, I think that maybe we should open up the discussion to questions. I can take questions here in the room, and Colin, if you will, you can take questions online. I recognize Brian Meeks here. Is off.
Hello. Hi, thanks, Patsy, Colin, Terry, and Jessica for a really stimulating discussion. There's so many things that I would like to say. First of all, congrats on the book. But in relation to Colin's comments, I want to take him up initially on this notion of we've made much more advance in European, North American integration than in Caribbean integration, or I don't know if you actually said made more advances, but made significant advances. And therefore, I think this is really an important lens to think about where we are. And what is it about migration that pushes people? I mean, it may be an obvious question, but I think it's one that requires more thorough thought. What is it that makes North America an attractive space? Obviously higher salaries, but obviously it's not only higher salary. What are the deficits in the Caribbean? If we start to think about the credits of migration versus the deficits, then we can begin to think more, in a more careful manner about what needs to be done to perhaps reverse those deficits. I think one lens that we can think about is Puerto Rico, which Puerto Rico is obviously a different case. It's an American colony, but it also has the advantage of everybody being a citizen. If you don't like it in Puerto Rico, you can move to Tampa. And Puerto Ricans do move to Tampa and have been increasingly moving to Tampa. So maybe we might look at Puerto Rico and say, what is it about the contemporary situation that has increased or again stirred the desire to move? And use that as a sort of lens to think about the Caribbean, which is not in Puerto Rico's space. But many islands or territories have more people in the States and in North America than they have in the island itself. And so we need to think about that. So that's one thing I wanted to put on the table, maybe a more thorough accounting in the future of that dichotomy as presented there in terms of models of integration. What does it mean to be integrated, for individuals to be integrated as opposed to countries to be integrated? The second thing really is that what I hear on the agenda is what Bob Marley said 40 years ago. It takes a revolution to make a solution. There's a degree of stasis in the Caribbean that requires not the same old, same old. It's not a question of adding, something fundamental needs to be done. And that, the character of that fundamental upheaval change, one doesn't want to put the form it may take. It may take an entirely peaceful form. It may take an institutional form. It may take a non-institutional form. But we're in a rut. We're in a serious rut. If you look at the statistics for crime, etc., run them down, we're in trouble. And therefore, it's not business as usual. And I just get that from, Patsy, Terry, and everybody's comments. Even Colin's carefully designed diagrams all have a deep pessimism surrounding them as to your options. And therefore, maybe we need to try new things, and one of the new things is essentially a bottoms-up approach, an approach which puts people first. And I'm talking too long, but just one final comment. What does putting people first mean across the range? Patsy has mentioned some of the instances. Terry-Ann has mentioned some. You need to put movement. Everybody must move anywhere at all times. Full stop. You want to move? You can move. You can move as though you went down the road from Trenchtown to Papine, using a Jamaican example that Jamaicans will recognize. The same way you move from Jamaica to Cayman or Trinidad or wherever it may be. Just take that out of the equation. You want to go to the beach? Then we can't have, this old slave colonial situation where black people can't get on the beaches in their own country, not because there's a law against black people, but because they can't afford it. And so, or that there's a sign or some guard illegally preventing them from going on the beach. And reinforce these things. And of course, loans for poor people so that they can, and credit for poor people so that they can make advances. So, there are a whole set of issues that are bottoms-up approach. And a bottoms-up approach could be revolutionary, but that is where Japan started in the 19th century. That is where Singapore and South Korea started in the 20th century. It's not entirely alien that bottoms-up approaches are what have led to partial breakthroughs in this time. We're talking too much. I'll stop talking.
Who did you want to respond?
Pardon me?
Who did you want to respond?
It was a comment to everybody. I was really responding to you all, who I thought all made great comments in that direction. But it just stimulated me to say a few things out of turn.
I'm happy to briefly respond. Great comments, great questions. Yeah, look, we are all aware of the major economic push and pull factors. Yeah, but I know many people who will be quite happy to stay if they were able to function, if they were to feel appreciated in the place of work, if they had voice in political affairs, if they had voice at work. Look, I have friends, of course, I still stay in touch. And of course, the region is a low-wage region in relative terms. Of course, we know that. That's a given. And that's not the complaint. The complaint is I actually have some ideas that might resolve some of these problems, but these ideas never see the light of day, or there isn't a space to discuss and share ideas. And of course, this gets to the point that everyone was making about the underdog, for example, or the lower class groups, etc. And Look, the region is a place of strong men. Yeah, strong men in terms of money, strong men in terms of politics, in terms of power. And on the point of revolution, all I want to say is this. Look, in functioning societies, there's a division of social labor, yeah? There's the academic that produces ideas. These ideas, if they're compelling, usually get involved in society and the activists, and then the political activists take those ideas perhaps to the grassroots supporters, and then there's some kind of two-way communication from the grassroots supporters to the activists, to the academic, etc. I think there is, of course, there's several links missing presently in the region in that social division of labor historically, and I'm talking about to the independence period in the region. The academics had to become academics. Sorry, the academics had to become activists. Yeah, and of course, the burden sometimes is too much, right? So we do need a collective effort as it relates to change. Using the word revolution, I don't want to comment on that, but I'm going to end my little response there.
Can I jump in on the immigration issue?
Sure.
You are so right. The Caribbean squanders its resources. It squanders people. It takes people for granted. And it's a paradox. It's really paradoxical because you'd assume that the smaller the place, the more it would want expertise. Instead, sometimes you get the opposite. You get the kind of, don't think because you went and studied or you have this that it means that you are better than me, or you are going to, of course you're not, but that you are going to have a voice, right? So I think there is this kind of, I don't know, a backlash to maybe a seeming increase in inequality, I don't know. But I think that we do find a way, because we're small, the external looms large. The external is what validates everything. And when we talk about a diaspora, you see that disconnect between trying to keep skilled people and skill. I'm not using skill. I think of skill as less elitist, as opposed to covering a broad range of talents. We're less focused on keeping people at home and making them feel that they can have value in their lives at home than in trying to attract the diaspora. You gain value in the Caribbean when you leave. Okay, so there's definitely that element of it. But also, migration is very much related to the policy of countries and the extent to which they allow migration. So we could want to leave as much as we want to leave. If the opportunities are not there, we won't be able to leave. And we have to remember that a lot of the reasons why people go to the US and Britain in a certain period is because there were deliberate policies to attract certain kinds of people to those countries that Caribbean people took opportunity of. And as for the desire to travel, I remember James Mitchell. I would always quote him because it had a profound impact on me. He said, how can you contain the dreams of people on an island 123 square miles? When you come from small places, there may very well be an outsized curiosity about the world and need to move beyond your very tiny geographical space. You're muted, Jessica.
No, still muted.
Yeah, thank you. I hope the background lawnmower doesn't disturb you all too much. I don't want to sound like a hopeless optimist, but I do feel compelled to say something, especially as I am the only one on our panel who presently lives in the Caribbean. So I think I can say a few things from actual day-to-day experience. I think two things. One, there are opportunities for political engagement, and there are opportunities for leveraging regional solidarity in movements, in protest movements, in critical movements from members of civil society, whether you, and it doesn't have to be elitist civil society. There is the exclusion. We are kind of conflating region and nation state. There are issues in our political situations which have to be addressed, first of all, at the national level. And then, but even if you're operating at the national level and you want a voice, you can, and even more so nowadays with social media and with all the digital technology, you can draw on alliances from the wider region. So there are times when but the region, within our partially constructed region, you cannot expect CARICOM, for example, to do everything, but you can draw on a number of links within that, and you can draw on various mechanisms. For example, when some Caribbean nationals working in Barbados at the University of the West Indies, who found that they were being excluded from voting, despite the fact that they had every right to participate in national elections, when they brought a case, not in a regional court, they brought a case in the Barbados courts, challenging their exclusion, their failure to be registered as voters, and they won. They won at the Supreme Court level in Barbados, and this attracted a lot of interest because increasingly across the region, if people have been living and working and have attained regional citizenship rights, they have a right to exercise those rights. But I am seeing that I think we have to be careful. It's not true that anybody who does not operate at an elitist level is deprived of the opportunity to live and work and contribute to life in another CARICOM territory. I'm saying that because in the OECS countries, and particularly in the smaller ones, also in not just sovereign OECS territories, in very small economies, there's a dearth of certain skills, and these are not only or always some of the elite skill categories. There can be a dearth of construction workers, certain type of construction workers. There can be a dearth of geriatric care assistants. There can be a dearth of nursing aides and so on. And you find that you can be, in a place like St. Kitts in the last years of the sugar industry. You know who are the people keeping the sugar industry going in St. Kitts? They were Guyanese sugar workers. Many of those people have stayed and contributed tremendously, Jamaicans and Guyanese above all, to all categories of life in many of the OECS territories. They've contributed as entrepreneurs, they've contributed as in community work, in contributing to the arts and so on. The art teachers and musicians have revived the teaching of the arts in schools and so on. These are things, and they have become citizens in every sense of the word. I'm not being idealistic about this. At the same time, and increasingly in this world that we live in today, narrow nationalism and parochialism is a force that we all have to fight against because it rears its head and all sorts of insecurities come up. But I think there is sufficient evidence militating against that to show that in all our small societies, we need one another. We need regional solidarity, and it helps to give opportunities to people beyond from the wider CARICOM and beyond that, because I can also tell you in my society, there's a growing number of people from the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Haiti who are making equally meaningful contributions that are recognized.
Can I
despite
interject?
all our narrowness.
Sorry.
So I just wanted to say that. Maybe I'm a hopeless optimist, but these are things that I observe every day.
Sorry, I want to interject, not because I don't value what you're saying, Jessica, although I feel I'm obliged to say that we're talking about the formal CARICOM mechanisms, not the contribution that ordinary people have made and can make. Okay, so just to clarify that. But we should have finished at 1:30, and we're basically taking liberties. So I just wanted to raise how you wanted us to proceed. I see Terry has her hand up. We have somebody in the audience here. We have some comments online. So I think that the extent to which we make comments, it's a bit rude not to allow our guests to ask questions or make comments. So I think that the extent to which we respond, we should be very brief, really brief. And I would like to give our audience, but Terry, since your hand is up and I think that it's an urgent thing, I suggest that we can go with you, and then I would take a question from the room, and then maybe Colin, you can read some of the comments and questions online. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Patsy. I'm actually going to respond to a question that came in on the chat from Gavin Myers. He was asking about whether we have this imagined sense of Caribbean identity. But before I do that, I just wanted to acknowledge Brian's comment about revolution. And it's really interesting because one of the perspectives that I documented in the book coming from young people, when CARICOM was talking about reforming his institutions, they said exactly that. He said, maybe what is needed is not a reform process, but a revolution. And so what Brian is speaking to is actually picking up the attitudes or the views of certain young people, not saying this is representative of all young people, but certain young people. But this idea of whether there is a imagined identity or a real identity, it's one of those things that I think is both, as there are all these contradictions. It's a CARICOM or an integration process where people are both in and out, where national sovereignty trumps regionalism, but regionalism also has a role in reinforcing either positive or negative aspects of the national polity. And it's the same thing with this idea of this Caribbean identity. It both exists rhetorically in CARICOM. The language of CARICOM documentation and meetings coming out of heads of government use the term regional identity, use the term citizenship, although they fall short of saying regional citizenship. They always say regional identity and citizenship. So it's as if they're moving towards this concept of a regional citizenship, acknowledging the rights that you have under the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. But then the question is, do we feel that we are citizens in the way we live our lives? And do we feel that the institutions that have been developed reflect those identities? And I think that's where we have a little bit of a challenge. And I think just the last point, so we can have other questions answered, is this issue of celebrating in this 50 years the longevity of CARICOM and so the oldest integration movement amongst developing countries. That's a great thing. But do we want or to celebrate just longevity, or do we want to celebrate sustainability and relevance? We can allow CARICOM to persist and merely persist. It will continue to persist for another 50. But do we want it to be more than that, to be an integration movement that reflects our aspirations and helps us to achieve? And I think that's something that I have to say has to be answered by the younger generation. At the time we started this project, I was considered a young person. I am no longer a young person. So I can't answer the question of what the new goals should be. We needed to have a younger person on the panel to share their views. My views are now perhaps a little bit passing, but it's for them, I think, to help us, not to exclude older persons, but I think it's for young people to help us to craft craft that agenda.
Okay,
Thank you.
so we have, thanks, Terry. We have a question here and then.
Yeah. There's
Introduce yourself.
oh, I'm Paget Henry, and I'm a professor here at Brown. There's a movement, I think, because the monarchy in England is collapsing, that there's a movement towards republicanism across the region. Barbados is now a republic. I just heard my prime minister say, yeah, Antigua and Barbuda, we should be a republic, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm wondering, is now everybody, I don't know, we've had a discussion about what kind of republics or what republicanism in the Caribbean should mean. What's the content of it? So again, we're operating purely at the formal level, that we don't want to be, have the queen as or the king as the head of state and all of that stuff anymore. That's totally collapsing. And so we need some formal constitutional status to replace what we are right now, whatever we call ourselves. And so we are just latching on to the formal structure of a republic. Maybe this is a good time for CARICOM to really start a discussion about what does republicanism mean in the context of our region, and what it is that we should be striving for as we move to this new formal constitutional status. It's a strong movement. People realize that this quasi-monarchical situation that we're under at the moment, that is collapsing. And that, we need to put some content, some real Caribbean content into what we mean by republicanism. So just anybody who wants to answer, I'll
Yeah.
be great.
Thank you, Paget. Thank you, Paget. I think that right now the focus is on getting rid of the Queen, and that makes a republic. But I think beyond whether republic is just a name, the question is what model of democracy we think we can make in these small states, and how we can rescue what can be rescued from Westminster parliamentary democracy, but how we can start from the perspective start from where we are, our location. I come from a country of 100,000 people. Why do I need to elect somebody to represent me? At that point, I can actually exercise direct democracy. So what are the potentials for radically different forms of democratic models? Can we show the world that's possible, than the elitist model we've inherited? So I think that all of this should be on the table. Yeah. Colin, I would pass over to you to...
Yeah, I'm happy to pose some questions. So Damien Greaves says, should we ditch functional cooperation? I think this is referring to some comments about ditching common currency, etc.
I think I replied to him, absolutely not. That's where we've made some of the best progress.
Same. I would agree.
Right, the others are comments. I'm just trying to...
Somebody mentioned that we didn't speak about OECS at all in this volume.
So there's a question about trust deficit. Should CARICOM be a pillar of social cohesion? Don't you think?
Yeah, but not if it continues to be promote an elitist agenda. That's my quick, abbreviated comment.
Right. So Dr. Gillian Marcel says that we should rely more on Caribbean scholarship to define Caribbean-wide citizenship, viability in every sense, economic and social, solidarity beyond elites. But this is a comment on a question. I'd be curious about what the Caribbean traditions are on this point, but I suppose we can comment. Terry Ann? So citizenship be rather than Trinidad and Jamaican, we're Caribbean citizens. I guess that's the point she's hitting home here. And of course, how do we strive for solidarity beyond elites?
Yeah,
People solidarity.
yeah. This is the question I think that we have to grapple with. Is it possible to create a truly regional sense of citizenship? Yes, I think it is possible. What that will look like, I don't have the answer, the answer to. But I think we see some of the examples in the solidarity movements. And again, coming back to a point I think Patsy made before, unfortunately, some of those movements have responded to crises, external imposed crises, and so on. So around COVID-19, the way in which young people were mobilizing to support each other across space and time in CARICOM and broader beyond CARICOM was an important sort of sense of regional solidarity that we see often. I think Halima speaks about it in terms of the gender movement and the movement against domestic violence and calling for better policies and regulations. So they already exist. The question is, are people doing this because they feel that it is a sense of regional duty and responsibility to do that? Or do they just naturally find in a sort of regionalized process, bottom up, just find that those common areas of interest and it grows organically and in a sense separate from the formal institutional process of integration or the formal integration process. And I think that they will operate concurrently. We have to give regional movements the opportunity to be independent and autonomous of governmental institutions, for them to find their legs and to be able to properly define what they want. But then we have to find a way to connect them. How do they connect and complement each other so that the regulatory environment can reinforce the aspirations of people? So I don't have a full answer yet, but I think that there are seeds of it starting in the region in different ways.
I suppose an appropriate follow-up would be, so Gavin Maya says, we have lots of work to do. Caribbean identity and the practice of being Caribbean is slowly being eroded in practice. Jessica, would you agree with that?
I'd say yes and no. I think Caribbean regional identity is very endangered at the moment, particularly because of the events of the last few years. The closing up of societies, the almost complete disappearance of regional transport and the ability to move among our countries for a few years did tremendous damage. Even though we are supposed to have institutions and processes to promote the ability to participate equally in each of the national economies in the region, governments find sneaky ways of undercutting those rights and of preventing people from really having access to their CARICOM, what is it? Skills certificate and things like that. Now, it's tricky. I don't think we can be completely utopian and think that regional citizenship can completely replace national citizenship. At the end of the day, we live in a collection of mini states, and you will find that lots of people, microstates, you'll find lots of people are theoretically in favor of a regional identity. And when it comes down to brass tacks, to fighting over basic economic rights, all of a sudden, the national prejudices rear their heads on things like
Jessica,
education. Yeah.
we kind of way past our time, so I think we need to
Yeah. No, so
wrap
what I'm
up.
saying, okay, let me summarize that and say that it's a vision, it's a dream, it's an ideal, and we are going to, I think that CARICOM and the wider, because regionalism goes beyond CARICOM too, we have to continue to work towards, as Terry said, fleshing out this vision. And we shouldn't be discouraged by the fact that nationalism is going to continue to be an obstacle for a long time to come. That is the reality of the world that we live in.
Okay, on that note, I think that we can close off the discussion. There's a question about the OECS and the lessons that the OECS has to
Many
offer.
valuable lessons.
And which, of course, is food for thought. And this is not a comprehensive volume. So that's obviously an area for exploration. But I want to thank everyone. We have tested your patience. Those of you who have the stragglers in the room still, thank you very much for being there. And those of you online who persisted with us. Thank you so much, Colin, for the excellent work you have done trying to make sense of this book and taking us beyond the book. Thank you so much to my collaborators, Terry and Gilbert Roberts, who has really been a rock through the process. And of course, to Jessica. It's always easier to do this kind of work when you have your little crew. It really makes life easier. And I want to just thank all of our contributors. There would be no book without you. And to say how much I appreciate you all. And thank you very much. I'm sorry, Alex, for trading on your good nature. So thank you so much. And to Kate and Emily and everybody here. Thank you. So with that, we'll leave. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Patsy.
Okay, bye-bye.